Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be doing a response video on Dennis Prager and a lecture he gave on Western civilization and its future. I'm half German and Dennis is a Jew, so yeah, this mix historically hasn't gone well, but bear with me as I try to do this as fair as I can.
Since I was a child, I have felt, and I am certain of this, brains are wildly overrated in their significance. Wildly. And in fact, I don't even find brilliant people interesting unless they're good. There are people who find brilliant bad people interesting. I don't. Goodness interests me more than brains.
Do you use your brain to come to that conclusion that brains are wildly overrated? Logic and brains are essential to ethics, or else it wouldn't make sense. Humans have a desire to know, and our minds are geared towards objectivity. Objectivity requires many moral values such as love of truth, and logic is the cultivation of objectivity. Virtues, as philosophers have noted, are tied with objectivity, and without such objectivity, virtues would be arbitrary. They rely on choosing the morally good, which takes development and practice. Dennis seems to be confusing knowledge and wisdom here. Knowledge just means you know things, while wisdom is an evaluative application of knowledge. To be wise is to be knowledgeable, but being knowledgeable doesn't mean you're wise. Brains is important here and not at all overrated.
I had a little role in, and that was a book that was just published, The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. Now, that's not bestsellerdom oriented, because Andalusian is not an everyday term for most people, even National Review readers. But of course, Andalusia was the part of Spain from about the 9th to the 14th centuries governed by Muslims. And there is this huge myth that Islam is a truly tolerant religion, and it isn't, and it never was. And that's not anti-Muslim.
This is a sort of guilt by association fallacy and confuses terms. It confuses religions as an ideology and how people practice said ideology. It's very well possible for someone to affirm belief in an ideology but not practice it and actually go against it. I find your claim that Islam or its people have never been tolerant to be inaccurate. Islam has been around for more than 1,000 years and it's had its good and bad time periods. Also, tolerance in of itself isn't good or bad. It depends on the subject matter. We shouldn't tolerate non-virtuous acts that hurt the flourishing conditions for other humans and prevent them from becoming virtuous. A big reason, although of course not the only reason, for the seemingly anti-tolerant Muslims we witness today in terrorism is bad foreign policies that have led to much of the radicalization. Very often, it's not the religion or reading the text that makes people radical, but it's the reverse. Radical people read the text to justify their radical behaviors. I'll link to a fellow libertarian named Killian's video on this. He gives good sources.
Incidentally, I have a theory that there were two major sea changes in American life that produced a sort of moral and intellectual deterioration, or an enfeeblement of the American mind. And they both took place after World War II. One is television, which did profoundly enfeeble American culture. If there were no television, we would be much better.
TV, while it has a lot of stupid stuff on it, which is partially the reason I'm glad I don't watch TV myself anymore, but despite my preference for not watching TV, I'd be foolish to not admit that it hasn't provided education and entertainment to people and actually has brought families together on occasion. TV has made us much more connected to cultures outside of ourselves and to politics than ever before. I'm curious, is your reason for saying it's bad is because it doesn't promote your particular ideology?
And there was one other development, widespread college attendance. It has enfeebled the American mind just as much, but much more dangerously, because people who watch TV don't assume they are brilliant, but people who get a PhD do think.
I agree 100% that people who get PhDs often tend to think they are brilliant and have an overinflated ego. Members of the new atheist movement like Jerry Coyne comes to mind. However, I think this rhetoric about liberal bias is true to an extent. I think Dennis goes overboard. Conservatives do have an uphill battle in some fields, and in many cases the disparity between conservatives and liberals is lifestyle driven rather than discrimination. Even a man you've had on your show, the political scientist Dr. Matthew Woessner, goes over the nuance. I hate to break it to you, Prager, but painting higher education as bad won't be encouraging conservatives to join and take over. It will just make the problem worse. Now, I do believe the disparity should be addressed, and perhaps certain fields with a liberal bias should be encouraged to have more diversity and to be willing to see things from another perspective, and perhaps we should try to make universities be more accommodating to students in general.
Anyway, it's true because the world is in terrible shape. It's always been in terrible shape, except there was reason for optimism. And now there isn't much reason for optimism because the good guys are losing. We're losing the most important country for goodness ever invented, the United States of America. And Western Europe is essentially lost, but it's been lost essentially.
Yep, so basically my ideology isn't being forced down the throat of other people, and therefore everything has to have gone to shit. Good to know.
I wrote a book on it, as it happens. So I am not oblivious to the amount of evil that has taken place in the West. However, evil is ubiquitous. Evil is universal. The only question mature people, which disqualifies most professors, and I don't mean that as a throwaway line, it does disqualify them. They stay in that profession because colleges are kindergartens. The only difference between kindergarten and college is the age of.
Conservatives do tend to want to ask, why is there good, rather than why is there suffering, as Dennis does throughout this part and a bit more later on. I think to focus on either solely is to miss half the picture. People tend to think suffering and goodness are not connected, but they in many cases are, like a married couple. Many good things like receiving lots of money can lead to suffering by losing trust in people you once thought that were your friends, and enduring suffering at times can make you a better person than you would be if you were sheltered from suffering. Also, Dennis, I hate to break it to you, but universities have been a hot spot for alcoholism and partying since its creation, with it being better or worse at times. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon for there to be degeneracy and at times murder on campuses. Liberals haven't ruined colleges, they've just taken over some of the problems that were there before.
Kind and foolish, just for the record, is I ask them if they believe people are basically good. If they do, and some of you might, and I don't mean to offend you, in that regard you are a fool. And why people choose to believe something so patently absurd is beyond.
I agree with you here. People are generally selfish assholes looking out for themselves. To quote Joker on Society,
you see, their morals, their code, it's a bad joke. Dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other.
Good. Human rights, Western concept, universal human rights. Western, uniquely Western. These are not just Western, they're uniquely. Human equality, all people are equal, Western. Democracy, Western. Abolition of slavery, Western. The greatest music, the greatest art, the greatest.
Christians and Jews didn't come up with many of those values or even those ideas, although I will readily admit that they innovated many of those ideas, which previously in Greek and Roman culture weren't given as much attention to, or at least not in a way necessary to make them stick. Getting rid of slavery isn't uniquely Western. Slavery has been abolished and reestablished multiple times throughout history in many different cultures for a variety of reasons, with economic economic and not moral concerns being a greater factor. We don't morally progress, as morality isn't like a point A to point B thing. It's a revolving door where good and bad behaviors are recycled throughout time. Also, what is the criterion are we assigning for things like best art? What does saying we have the best painting really mean outside of a statement of preferences?
What happened? And we got into a debate about whether or not you could have objective good and evil if there's no God. And every atheist, I debated this at Oxford, and the atheist I debated, the first thing he said was, Mr. Prager is right. If there is no God, there is no objective good and evil.
Now, Dennis extends this to say virtually every atheist philosopher acknowledges that you need God for objective morality. This is clearly false. As the David Chalmers survey points out, a little more than 56% of philosophers believe in objective morality, and almost 73% of the philosophers identified as atheists. Dr. Eric Wielenberg, David Brink, Galen Strawson, Thomas Nagel, Peter Singer, etc. are all moral realists, along with other philosophers, and as far as I know, none of them appeal to God.
The founders knew. Let me just read to you one perfect example. John Adams, okay? John Adams. Because we have no government armed with power, capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. By the way, see, they understood people are not basically good. That's the point. Human passions unbridled. They were afraid of human passions. Something's got to control human passions. Either the government will, or what will? Answer, religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government.
This is what John Adams said to the Massachusetts militia on October 11, 1778, and in this he is merely using religion as meaning the same as morality, which is what you get when you read the next sentence on revenge. Now, contrary to what separationists say, and what the right says about this is not talking about making America a theocracy, but values. It really has nothing to do with the government structure as such, but rather the virtues one citizen need to have a successful government.
Wife, Franklin and I have identical theologies. Identical. And to call him a deist is an absurdity. He believed that God judges every human being. That's not a deist. A deist is God created the world and then checked out. Not one of the founders.
To say none of them held that position is dishonest. I don't deny that few founders were actually deists by the correct term you laid out. Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine would be the two that come to mind. Thomas Jefferson often gets called a deist, but he was more likely a Unitarian in my opinion. But there is debate over that, so I won't stick to it.
Of goodness. What happened when Judeo-Christian religion died? Specifically Christianity in Europe, you got Nazism and communism. People don't stop believing in religions when God-based religion dies. They just...
No. Well, Germany, in terms of moral spirit, was described as godless after World War I. Much of Germany was very religious, and in fact, Protestantism was one factor in the ideology of the Nazis. Although, mainly what the Nazis believed in would be considered heretical under the tenets of Christianity. It wasn't godlessness that drove Germany to Hitler. It was economic depression and being desperate for change that did it. Hitler was simply there to take advantage of that.
To be made. There is no secular case for anything. Here's an example. What's the secular case against public nudity? It's not a riddle. There is none. I assume all of you oppose public nudity.
Depends on what you mean by secular. There is definitely godless normative ethics in terms of deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics that can make the case for them. Even secular natural law could help, and one could say that it's just a brute fact.
The end of borders in personal conduct. There is now a movement in the Liberal Party in Sweden. The Independent and other places in England just reported this. A movement by young Swedes in the Liberal Party to legalize incest. Brothers and sisters over 15 who wish to have intercourse should be allowed to. It is none of the country's business whether they do so or not. And they're right. The only argument there, too, is religious. And please don't give me the health argument that incest produces mental retardation. It doesn't, except after many.
Even without taking into account genetics, it is shown that often houses with incest are unstable, such as the father raping his daughter, the mother sexually assaulting her son, and so forth. The state would have a compelling interest to not promote these types of relationships, even if no pregnancy occurred, as it destroys the family union. Also, Dennis is plain wrong. It doesn't take multiple generations. The odds of a birth defect go up in the first generation of cases. Birth defects, that is. Animals and even plants avoid incest. I find it funny that he says the Hebrew Bible forbids incest when it made exceptions, as was the case with Adam and Eve, along with some of their offspring. Later on, he would claim that Egyptians glorified incest, but I would say no more so than the Habsburgs in the 16th to 18th century. Pharaohs and certain priests were allowed to do that, and it would usually be forbidden outside of royalty. They committed incest to preserve what they felt was their divine bloodline and for political points with the population.
The idea that you only fight when you think you'll win is a little silly. You don't have to fight if you think you'll win. Then you'll win. It's the time to fight is exactly when you don't think you'll win. Then your fighting is most necessary. So of course, to me it's an.
This idea that you fight when you think you'll win is part of the just war theory, and is very smart because generally only idiots storm off into a battle they don't strongly believe that they can win in. Well, idiots and people that live in honor cultures. People in honor cultures might prefer to go down in a blaze of glory than stand back and take it. However, even they didn't rush into it. You can fight if you think you'll win, so you know you can assess the costs and benefits. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.